so I'm here to talk about what information we are able to glean about online and blended learning enrolments in Australian higher education. EFTSL has a very rich data set and it's data on all types of providers in the higher education sector in Australia. And so it's sometimes unusual to get information across all types of providers, and this is an attempt to do that. So we thought it was a good thing. As Anthony said, there are a few, they're almost in the category of urban myths about online learning. You know, the attrition rates are higher, satisfaction levels are lower, etc. So we thought that it might be worthwhile to at least show you what sort of information we do have and what the findings from analysing that information is. So, in fact, the data from higher education institutions in Australia on online enrolment is collected as part of the Commonwealth Department of Education student collection, and it's collected through an element called mode of attendance. There are three possible values for that: internal, flexible and external, and it's captured at the student level, not at the subject or course level, which is where you might expect to glean richer information about whether the study is being undertaken online or in some sort of combined way. So, in fact, in a few research studies that have been recently conducted in the sector, this issue of whether it's actually possible in Australian higher education to accurately measure the number of students studying online, that possibility is hampered a bit by the nature of the data collection. And so, as this slide says, we are sort of using, and researchers have been using, these labels as surrogates for online learning. The original collection is very much a long-standing collection, internal, external, and the recent addition of flexible instead of multimodal. And internal is being interpreted as face-to-face enrolment. Flexible is the more commonly used blended enrolment, and the external, which used to be often involved packaging up materials in hard copy and sending them out to students, has largely been replaced by fully online studies. So that's how we're using in this, what I'm using in this presentation, the descriptors for the data. So I'm using the surrogates in this presentation. As I said, this data is collected at the student level, not the course or the unit, and so it doesn't actually give a true picture of online enrolments. It relies on the fact that students who are participating in a mixture of face-to-face activity and some IT-enabled learning. It relies on them being reported accurately as blended at the student level, but we can't get a clearer picture of of what the enrolments actually look like, except in terms of this element. And I think it's very interesting because we keep hearing how important online learning is in terms of the future profile of higher education in Australia. And I guess it's my view that it would be, given this increased emphasis on that, it would be good to get the data collection right, and maybe we ought to give some thought in Australia to making that collection more reliable. So now we get into some of the numbers. This chart shows an index growth in sector EFTSL by mode of attendance, so those three categories. I've indexed them back to a starting point of 1 because they're very different in size, these groups. As you see from the top line there, which is the blended enrolment line, which relative to the 2012 enrolment has has experienced a significant increase, an increase 3 times of what the proportion of enrolments were in 2012. But in fact, they only represent 1.7% of all EFTSL enrolled in the sector in 2016, and that's about 18,000, a bit over that, EFTSL. But you see it's had a massive relative increase over that time. The second line is the online or wholly online data, and that actually represents quite a significant number, 128,000 out of a bit over 1 million enrolments in the Australian sector at the moment. So it's 12.2% of all of the 2016 EFTSL enrolled in higher education. And that's experiencing a slight increase, but nothing like the blended, relatively like the blended enrolments. And finally, the pink line is the line for face-to-face enrolments, and there's over 900,000 of those. So face-to-face enrolment is still the most significant enrolment in the sector across all levels of the study, and that represents 86% of all. So, but there's no doubt that off a small base, blended and online learning are the areas of growth in Australian higher education over the last 5 years. So given that, which type of provider enrolls the greatest percentage of online students? So these, and this chart is displayed using the 4 categories that TEXA uses to classify higher education providers in Australia. So the first group are for-profit private institutions, second not-for-profit privates, the third, which is a very small group, is the TAFE institutes. So these are not private providers, these are government-based TAFE providers, and the yellow pillars there represent the university sector. So I found this a rather surprising outcome, that in fact the group providing the highest proportion of enrolments of online students is in fact the not-for-profit sector, and they tend to be religious organisations or professional associations. So that surprised me slightly, because it wasn't what I was generally hearing when I was talking to people about online education. So then we move on to, well, which fields of education attract the most online enrolments? And again, there's a sort of another myth here. Well, it's that the booming field for online enrolments is commerce, management and commerce. And in fact, it is a very big proportion. There are close to 30,000 students enrolled online in that field at the moment in 2016. But in fact, there are 4 quite significant major fields which attract this type of student. And they are, as shown there, management and commerce, society and culture, health and education. And I've aggregated some of the other fields, and over a set of fields like that include natural and physical sciences, engineering, IT, agriculture and environmental studies. I've put them together as combined sciences, and all of those together, so you can see the emphasis is more on the education and humanities and business rather than the sciences, which is, I suppose, not surprising given history of where this field's, where online enrolments have come from. And the second group I've called combined creative arts, and I've included architecture and building because of the design element, and creative arts in that field. But this was a little bit surprising that to me that these were the the first four fields that I've mentioned were they were the bulk of the enrolments, and it wasn't all management and commerce in terms of where the enrolments were falling. And so then the next question, given the growth from a small base about blended enrolments, is that a more popular form of online learning, and are the patterns the same? And as you can see from this chart, the high relative levels of enrolment shown here in 2016 across all of the fields I think reflects that increased interest in these, but the four major fields that I've mentioned in respect of online study are reflected also in this, but the patterns are a bit more erratic. So where are these online and blended enrolments shown? And of course, as we might have expected, the majority of them are at the bachelor degree level, the AQF level 7. But again, the enrolments in level 8, AQF 8, are in fact, in relation to fully online, are actually as big as the master's degree ones, which are the AQF 9. And again, I sort of expected that the master's degree, which is sort of tending to be the level of qualification that postgraduate students are looking for rather than the postgraduate dips, they're good and strong enrolments, but they're not way out there ahead of the lower level graduate diplomas and certificates. And again, there's a slightly more erratic pattern of enrolments shown for blended, which is the graph to the right. Then another myth is that a lot of these students are, in fact, offshore students. And this chart shows for each of the type of higher education providers, for-profits, not-for-profits, TAFEs and universities. So where are the majority of enrolments for each of those types of providers? Well, as you can see from the far right of this, the patterns for TAFE and universities, although very different in size, these are represented as percentages, but virtually of those enrolments, the majority of them, and this is a little surprising, are offshore. So in the universities, that would reflect the number of offshore campuses and so forth that are in place in the university sector in Australia. But TAFE shows from a small enrolment base again, but virtually 100% of their enrolments are in the face-to-face category. In the face-to-face category are actually in offshore operations, and slightly smaller percentage when you look at the onshore situation. And again, there are different patterns for the for-profits and the not-for-profit providers, as the fields of study or field of education data also showed. Very different sort of pattern between those two categories. So then I started thinking about, well, what about some of the other myths? Is it true that online and blended enrolment students are less satisfied with their study that they undertake in these modes? And in fact, this data is from the QUILT survey that is undertaken by a significant proportion of the current higher education providers in Australia. And so this is the median satisfaction score by mode of attendance. And the and what interests me about this graph is that it starts off with quite disparate types of satisfaction levels. Back in 2012, the face-to-face was pretty much showing greater satisfaction than the either blended or the online. But by 2017, they virtually converged. So there doesn't seem to be an argument now that as students are experiencing online and blended education at the moment, that they are more dissatisfied than their face-to-face colleagues in higher education. So I thought that was an interesting result. The final thing that I wanted to look at was what attrition looks like in these different types of institutions, and by type of study. So, and this graph intrigued me as well, because in fact what this shows, the pink line along the bottom, is the one for the blended enrolments, and in fact attrition is lower for students who are undertaking blended type of study than face-to-face students, which are generally regarded as the ones with the lowest rates of attrition. So in fact, fully online, it looks as if attrition is higher for that mode, as far as we can trust the data. But the surprise to me was that the combination of online with face-to-face study in the blended enrolments shows a much more favourable attrition situation. So that's the snapshot. And so I just really wanted to summarise this by saying, for me there were some confirmations in this data, even though it has its limitations. And I guess, as I've documented them there, that there certainly has been a large relative growth in online and blended study in the last 5 years in Australia. Most online enrolments are in bachelor degree courses, followed by masters by coursework, but very closely behind it, the grad dips and the grad certs that are offered as AQF level 8s in Australian higher education. And the final point, that what everyone says, oh well, yes, of course online students have higher attrition rates, and that does show up in the data, but it's not nearly as pronounced as one might have expected it to be. And for me, the surprises, and they might not be surprises for you because you're the experts in online education, but the fact that society and culture is in fact the largest field for online study, not business and commerce or management and commerce. Several fields of study have large numbers of online students, including health and education, as shown in the charts that I presented. Not-for-profit providers enrol the greatest proportion of online enrolments. There are converging levels of student satisfaction by mode of attendance over time. And the final one, that blended enrolments have lower attrition rates than internal students, which I think is not what the general espoused view is about attrition in the sector. So I hope that's given just a little snapshot. It is in respect of all those different types of higher education providers. It's not, universities are one of 4 categories. And as you see from the data, there's quite a difference in the patterns and profile of student enrolments that are included in each of those. So I hope that sets things up for the day, and we can go on to talk about how that profile impacts on the sort of strategies we have in the sector for online learning quality assurance. Thanks.